starts from September to June. So there will be still one more before the summer break this year. For those that may not know, Zero Waste Europe is a Brussels-based NGO working on changing policies to achieve a circular economy. And it's also a network of organizations across Europe that really do implement zero waste strategies across Europe. My name is Justine Maillot. I work as a consumption and production campaigner here at Zero Waste Europe, and I'm also the policy coordinator for the NGO Alliance Rethink Plastic. And so indeed, as I said, today we're gonna dig into circular economy. What do we mean when we all have this objective of achieving a circular economy? Is it actually achievable? What indicators are we using to measure progress towards the achievement of a circular economy? What type of strategies and policies are actually really needed to achieve this objective? So with our speakers today, we're gonna explore that. So today with us, we'll have Caspar, who's from the Circular Economy based in Amsterdam, as well with us today, Henning from the Wuppertal Institute, and Maeve from Friends of the Earth Europe. So we'll have, as I said, 90 minutes. We'll basically have each speaker presenting for about 10 minutes, then a short Q&A about 10 minutes as well. Which will lead us to about an hour. And then the last half an hour would be really an open discussion with the speakers. So you may have noticed that there's a chat and a Q&A section. So feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself, but please ask your question in the Q&A. I will keep an eye on it, and also my colleague Rosella, that you cannot see but is here, will also help do that with me. If you are joining us on YouTube, you also can use the Q&A section from YouTube directly, and we'll keep an eye on that as well. So welcome everyone, really excited. I think we can jump right in with our first presenter, Caspar van Nijs, who's project manager and consultant at the Circular Economy. And you may know him because he's the co-author of the Circularity Gap Report that is published every year at the World Economic Forum. Circular Economy is an impact organization with the mission to empower a global community of businesses, cities, and governments to accelerate the transition to the circular economy through practical and scalable insights and solutions that address humanity's greatest challenge. In his role at Circular Economy, Caspar conducts research and develops the messaging for the Circularity Gap Reporting Initiative and works on consulting projects with corporate partners. He holds a master's degree in global business and sustainability from the Rotterdam School of Management, and has prior experience in strategy consulting, where he formed a passion for integrating circularity into business strategy. So the floor is yours, Caspar. You're gonna present the gap report and some of the many indicators that can be used to kind of measure circularity. Thank you.
Yes, thanks so much for that introduction. I hope everyone are you seeing my screen okay?
Not at the moment, it's coming, it seems.
Let me see.
Yes, now we can. Perfect.
Yes?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, again, thanks for the warm welcome, and also really the invite. Very happy to be here today. Thanks to the Zero Waste Europe team for having me. My name is Caspar van Daniels. Indeed, I'm here today mainly as the co-author to the Circularity Gap Report, the most recent edition of which we have launched in January. And what we do in it is we kind of provide an update on the status of the global circular economy, and then also explore different approaches of how we can leverage the circular economy to also address some of our bigger environmental challenges, for instance, the climate crisis that we've addressed a bit in this year's report. More on that in just a second. Circular Economy, as was just mentioned, it's a nonprofit organization out of Amsterdam. We focus a lot on creating the type of research and analysis needed to accelerate the circular economy and mobilize kind of stakeholders across the board, across governments, cities, and businesses. Maybe as the image suggests, I would like to talk a bit more today about the Circularity Gap Report and take you a bit into the world of material flows and what it all tells us about how we can measure the progress towards a circular economy. Maybe starting on that, so the circular economy that we think about here is really also based on those 3 key principles on designing out waste and pollution, keeping products and materials in use for as long as possible, and regenerating natural capital and ecosystems. And that is certainly an ambitious task to do all that, and we're not quite there yet. The good news is the circular economy has been gaining a lot of momentum in the past years with a lot of strong commitments from several governments and also the European Commission. But to really start rolling it out and kind of guiding that concerted action and understanding, we seem to lack a better understanding of where we currently are at. How can we start measuring what does full circularity even look like? And that is kind of where our Circularity Gap Report also, the idea for it came into play, just asking the simple question of how circular are we actually today? Where are we at in this journey? This is the result from that, from trying to answer that question. And it's, of course, with that number, 8.6% circular. It's a bit of an alarming one because there's an additional notion to this. The world is 8.6% circular, but that's actually decreasing. Just 2 years earlier, when we did the analysis, it was slightly above 9%. And that relates to another somewhat grim milestone that our economy has recently surpassed, because we're actually consuming more than 100 billion tons of resources coming into our economy every year. So that's kind of a material footprint. But let me try maybe providing even a bit more insight into the metabolism that's behind this number, and showing you this maybe somewhat overwhelming graphic. It's kind of a Sankey diagram. We often refer to it as the X-ray of the global economy. And what it does, it illustrates, going from left to right, how do materials flow through the economy. And I know it might be a bit hard to read, but what you can see is how on the left-hand side, we really start looking at extraction of the different core material groups, so minerals, ores, fossil fuels, and biomass. And we see how they flow through different stages of extraction, processing, producing, turning them into products to ultimately then service and satisfy our key societal needs as an economy, as a society. And that relates to to housing, to nutrition, to mobility, as well as consumables, healthcare, services, or even communication equipment. And what we can also see, even after that, going further to the right, is what happens to all of these materials at the end of the time span that is considered for this type of analysis. So we always look at how do materials pass through the economy within the space of 1 year. So what you can see after this 1 year, we see a lot of materials that are kind of emitted or dispersed, or even wasted, end up as waste. But we also see a lot of materials that are added to stock. And that's, of course, an important notion. So the socioeconomic stock that refers to everything that stays in our economy for much longer than just that year. So you think of houses, roads, the heavy machinery, the transport vehicles that we use. But then, we see that last fraction, a very crucial one, which is that of waste. And within that, especially what is lost in terms of waste, and what of it makes it back into our economy as a resource. And what we see there, it's these 8.6 gigatons of cycled resources that make it back into our economy as an input. And that's how we calculate the circularity metric, or also in its inverse, the circularity gap. But what you can think about here is that what this metric almost does is it thinks of our economy as an organism, and the metric shows the degree to which we're able to feed this economy's need for materials with materials that are already used. And both of these angles are really important. So the need for raw materials, as well as the share of materials that come from secondary sources. Because becoming more circular doesn't only mean that we need to move entirely to secondary resources and increase that share, but we also really need to decrease our overall need of resources. And that is, of course, all the other strategies of a circular economy that go far beyond recycling, that actually form the core of it. If we start zooming in a bit more into what happens if we don't look at just the world, there's a few kind of things to bear in mind. One thing is that what you see kind of on top of these three graphs is what goes into an economy and what it goes out as exports and imports. And I'm just showing kind of three type of examples of how the material metabolism of a region can really look very different. And in actually the 2020 edition of the Circularity Gap Report, we outlined three specific types of countries. So on the left-hand side, you can see what we term build countries. So these are small emerging economies that have a really small footprint, limited trade activity also at this point. So small amount of imports coming in and exports going out. But we also see shift countries in the middle. Those countries have an extremely high import footprint. So a lot of materials coming into the economy are consumed domestically, but also significantly exported. For these countries, especially when you start looking at per capita footprints, they're immensely huge. So those are industrialized, this represents the majority of industrialized nations. And on the right-hand side, you see kind of an even bigger footprint, which we see in a lot of the sort of emerging economies that are also our manufacturing and extraction powerhouses. So on the trade balance, they are a bit smaller because they actually extract a lot of the materials. On a per capita level, they don't even consume that much. But for instance, a country like China, of course, then still that amounts to an immense footprint. And then they export a lot of their products to other countries. Why is it so important to look at this? Because every material metabolism of every region is different, and that also has repercussions on how we approach circularity for each of these countries. So understanding a bit how these material metabolisms are different from region to region is really important, and also understanding how to interpret different metrics that we develop about the circularity of a region, and how we can ultimately then develop strategies that help us become more circular. And what I wanted to show next is a few of these analyses that we've already done on also the regional or even the national level within the context of Europe. And what you can see, it varies a lot. So there's a clear call to action. We need to start putting the numbers to work, but we see then it can vary from 2% in Norway, which is an extremely has an extremely high material footprint, especially relating also to the domestic consumption and all the fossil materials produced. But also we have materials like the Netherlands that have already, countries like the Netherlands that have already become much more efficient at optimizing the footprint per capita needed and cycling a lot of the resources domestically. So what we see is there's a clear call to action in starting to put these numbers to work and develop more of a clear direction of how we can strengthen our circular economies, or the circular economy overall. And yeah, we think concrete action in terms of putting the numbers to work is needed locally on the ground. But yeah, there's a lot more of that needed. And of course, we need more than just that one indicator, because there's much more to this story. And that's what I wanted to quickly touch upon by talking briefly about metrics. And there's two studies that were published this year and last year by the Platform for Accelerating the Circular Economy, PACE, and Circular Economy, looking at metrics for governments, but also for businesses. So how can we build an even stronger evidence base for the circular economy transition and really look at a more nuanced picture of metrics? And what that looks like, I wanted to show in just a second. Because metrics can really be quite different on the circular economy. So on the left-hand side, you can see kind of a classification of how the metrics actually describe performance. For instance, at an aggregate level, so these indicators that we've just seen on the circularity gap metric or the circularity metric, but even then going a level deeper, how does it connect to key impact domains? How does it connect to then how much material goes in or goes out? So really breaking those down further, a bit further. And then also transition indicators that tell us, even at a lower level of aggregation, what's happening within the material metabolism, but also what are enabling factors that we need to have in a circular economy. On the right-hand side, we can also see how our metrics that we're currently see. So this comes from an assessment that the World Business Council for Sustainable Development did, how metrics are spread throughout different stages of the value chain. So we see there's already quite a bit of a good understanding of how we source raw materials, how in our operations we apply circular economy principles, and then of course at the end of life. However, what we don't really know a lot about is how can we measure circular design and how that ultimately also affects the distribution and the use of products and how that is extended through a circular economy. And going further, I wanted to also show a bit, trying to zoom out again a bit, to what extent are we currently able to really measure the circular economy in that detail? Because we see all these metrics coming up, and that's great, but which of them can we actually measure? And in the graph on the left-hand side, you can see some of the indicators marked in red, in green, that we're already able to measure quite well. So that's really what we're talking about just a second ago, about what goes into an economy, what goes out, and to what extent we manage to cycle things. As we look more to the inner loops of a circular economy, and arguably those are, of course, the important ones. How do we manage to extend the lifetime of products and keep things in materials in use for as long as possible? That's still extremely difficult to build a quantified evidence base for. Another point that I wanted to highlight is the connection to impact. Of course, the circular economy is not a goal in itself. It's a concept that we apply in trying to reach other environmental and social economic goals, and mainly tackle some of the key big challenges that we're facing, such as climate change, such as biodiversity, and ensuring that our economic activity is not toxic to humans or ecosystems. But what we see that there is actually still extremely difficult to make that link between the circular economy. So how can we tie our metrics on material flows to the actual sort of impact domains within which we want to achieve that, those benefits? And that's where a lot of research is currently being done, but we're still kind of well underway. The last thing I wanted to mention today is to start zooming a bit into the European context. And what is worth mentioning is that Europe has generally been leading the pack in this field by already setting an ambitious circular economy agenda, defining the circular economy action plan, and also the landscape of metrics applied by the EU and its different organs and institutions has been defined for quite some time already, but still also this one is evolving still. And I think you can see already in the different years where these kind of frameworks come from, those has evolved quite a bit. So the main one to consider at this point then is the monitoring framework set up by the European Commission in 2018. I won't be able to go in detail into it, but what's important is to really look at how it also considers material flow connected indicators and has quite a range of them through production, consumption, waste management, and the use of secondary raw materials, but also how it goes into enabling factors of the circular economy, so competitiveness and innovation. And I think it's important to here always consider what is the ambition behind the measurement. So is it really to benchmark and compare against others, or is it more to set that baseline to start your journey and identify opportunities? And is it more to really report in broad terms for the for more detailed for more detailed environmental accounting? And I think in the EU that is also then ultimately what the different stakeholders of the EU need to see and how they can really best leverage these resources from the European Commission. I think Eurostat, so that's where this data is reported on, has made great strides towards aligning the data and enabling more and more comparability. But of course, also there, that can't always be guaranteed that it's all comparable and accurate across all the member states, because that's just a big administrative challenge also. Having made a bit the bridge towards the European context, I think I can hand over to the discussion, and then also afterwards to the fellow panelists. But yeah, again, thanks for listening, and looking forward to discuss this further.
Thank you very much, Caspar. I feel like it was a lot of information in a very short time frame. And some of the graphs are definitely to process, maybe separately. Maybe a few clarification questions. I'm going to try two at the same time. One is a question on the 2018 WBCSD chart, if that's the right name. Perfect. Could you restate what the 100% represents? And there was another question on how, in the context of your report, you have defined circularity. So, for example, are you taking, where do you draw the line? Are you taking into account waste to energy, for example? Is food waste as composting included? So maybe if you could clarify a little bit what is the definition in this context. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe in going into the first question on that graph, so that was a landscape assessment that the World Business Council did by just really looking through a lot of different indicators that they could find. And then also after they had done a certain amount of review, and that review probably isn't even fully accurate anymore because new indicators have been defined since then. But within that, they really then looked, okay, how does that relate to different stages or aspects of the circular economy and stages in a circular value chain? And in terms of our definition of circularity, that would include all materials that are cycled back. So mainly, of course, that is recycling at this point, because that's where the statistics are the strongest. Composting would also be considered here. And waste to energy is always a bit of a difficult one, as much as possible, as that can be differentiated. That is, if there's a significant energy gain, in this case, yes, this was considered. But a lot of times, of course, waste is incinerated, and there might be some energy that can be leveraged from it, but that would not be considered. So in European data, for instance, that would be differentiated quite well. It's not always possible when you look at the full world. I think that the main point that we want to highlight, though, also is that the core of the circular economy needs to aim towards reducing the material footprint through what we consider more the inner cycle. So effectively, recycling already is one of the least desirable strategies of a circular economy. Much rather, we want to reduce the footprint overall and extend the use of what's already in there. And that's very much also the definition that we pursue here with the gap reports.
Thank you very much, Caspar, for the clarification. I think some of the questions will go back to this in the proper chat at the end of the session. And I think this is a good transition to Henning, who's going to focus actually more on prevention as well. So Henning is the director of the Circular Economy Division at the Wuppertal Institute for Climate, Environment and Energy based in Germany, and that many of you probably knows. So he owns a master's degree in economics, PhD in waste infrastructure planning, and is a lecturer for resource economics at the Schumpeter School of Economics in Wuppertal as well. He coordinates several research projects on transition processes towards a circular economy, waste prevention and sustainable waste management, including for the European Commission, the European Environmental Agency and the OECD. And as I mentioned, the focus is going to be on prevention. The floor is yours, Henning.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and of course for the possibility to give a short input on prevention, because you asked, are we getting closer to a circular economy in Europe? And let me get to my first slide. I think this is something that Caspar already perfectly addressed. There is little increase when it comes to the different indicators. Here, for example, the circular material use rate by the European Commission. We see, if we look at the development from 2010 to until today, there is more stagnation. We don't really get closer to it. But of course, there are some silver linings, looking especially at the Circular Economy Action Plan by the Commission. If they actually implement that, I think we will see a lot of emphasis on closing material loops, on improving recyclability of products. So I think there is good reasons for hope. But looking at the second indicator that Caspar already mentioned in the set of circular economy indicators, we see a quite different development. This is the development of municipal solid waste generation per capita in kilogram. And here we see that this steadily increased from around 480 kilogram just 10 years ago. And now we exceeded for the first time an average waste generation, municipal solid waste generation of 500 kilogram per capita in year. And my feeling is that there's a certain risk that more and more people ask now, why should we care about waste generation and waste prevention if the products get more and more circular, if businesses get circular, if we close the material loops? So I think it's really important and it's time to put more emphasis on waste prevention. This is a report that we're presenting right now. It's based on a 2 years project together with the German Society of Technical Engineers, and that we're currently handing over to our Ministry of Science, where we developed a circular economy roadmap for Germany. I know that other countries in Europe, like the Netherlands, like France, developed that years ago. We've been lagging behind in Germany, but now we also got our roadmap focusing on the key leverages towards circular economy, taking the specific topics of plastic packaging and batteries. If you're interested, here you have the link. The English version will probably be uploaded tomorrow or in the coming days. And in this report and for the analysis presented in the report, we specifically asked ourselves what could be the role of waste prevention and increasing resource efficiency in the production processes by new consumption patterns compared to recycling. And first outcome in our modeling is very clear. Without the transformation towards the circular economy, we will not be able to achieve the goal of climate neutrality by 2050. This is a very clear message that comes out of the report. The second thing is that we will have to drastically reduce the amount of natural resources that we use. You see it here in red. For the primary raw materials, we need to achieve a reduction by a factor of 4 until 2050. Without that, we won't become climate neutral. And the interesting thing with regard to the role of waste prevention is that you see that half of the resource savings will come from improved recycling by closing the circularity gap, as Caspar mentioned it, by making more of the waste that we actually produce. But the other half will have to come from waste prevention. Here we have to think about new product designs, new business models, more stringent policies on waste prevention. So from a total amount, from a resource perspective, they're equally important. We also looked into the economic incentive structures, and there we see that although the recycling would cover 50% of the necessary savings, it will only lead to 10% of the economic savings. So from an economic point of view, there's a clear need to foster and support waste prevention because it's much more profitable, or at least it can be. Now, we talked to a lot of industry representatives in different working groups, and we see that waste prevention is probably linked to higher profits, but also the risks are definitely higher. So we need courageous companies, but we also need policies that support these companies by investing in waste light production technologies, for example. Looking at the policies, that is something that we do for the European Environment Agency. We coordinate the so-called waste prevention progress reports on behalf of the EEA. Also, if you're interested, available for download on the EEA website. Last year's issue was on preventing plastic waste. And here a first good message. If you look at the changes in plastic packaging waste intensity, and if you compare the different countries, you see that policies actually matter, depending on how seriously the different member states took the issue. You see that some manage to actually prevent waste, in others we still have clear increasing amounts of plastic waste in relation to GDP developments in these countries. If we look at the specific policies, so the instruments that have been used to prevent waste, and specifically plastic waste, we see that most of them is still based on informative measures, voluntary agreements, but we see indeed an increasing share of more stringent measures. So regulatory measures, banning plastic products, for example, as well as market-based instruments. So this is a good trend. What we see that the financing partner, actually this addressing the risks of waste prevention is still really underrepresented. At only 3% of the measures that we analyzed go into that direction. So if you ask me, it's absolutely necessary that we have more policies on eco-modulation of packaging licensing fees, and these have to take into account also waste prevention, not only recyclability. And then already my final slide, looking at the 2021 prevention report, and that will address textile waste prevention. And for me, this will have to be one of the really big issues in the coming years. Now we talked a lot about plastics, and somehow we forgot to talk about textile waste. If we look at the numbers, we see that the global textile production has tripled since 1975. Based, for example, on changed business models, we see that the number of collections per year, in the past we had a summer collection and a winter collection. Now we have up to 24 different collections, and every time the stores are cleared, a lot of it is disposed or incinerated. We also have, especially during COVID, more and more online sales. We have more and more returned goods that are not brought back into the system, that are disposed or downcycled. And if you look at the CO2 emissions of the textile sector, you see that on per year that already exceeds the total emissions from international flights. So there's very, very good reasons to think about how can we address it, what kind of policies would enable us to prevent textile waste in the future. And here for us, based on the analysis, we see 4 points. We need a system of extended producer responsibility also for textiles. Some countries are working on it. Most of them have it for packaging waste, but we need clear standards from the European Commission on that topic. We clearly need a ban on disposal and incineration of overproduction and returned goods. The Commission promised to work on that. We have ongoing processes in France and Germany. We need that coordinated on the EU level at least, and we need it fast. And then third point, there's a clear need for more support for new business models. All these startups, they're struggling, for example, with tax laws, with financial regulations that make it really challenging for them, although they provide us with really innovative, smart solutions, how to produce less textile waste. And then final point, we need prevention targets. Also that was announced, and if we go into that direction, we don't need it only for packaging waste. We need it especially for textile waste, because here the figures have exploded over the last year, and we need clear directions for everyone involved in the different value chains. What kind of textile waste can we actually afford? What is our vision of a circular textiles industry? With that, thank you very much. Really looking forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Henning. And I think you made a very important point. It's indeed about closing the circle, but it's also about the size of the circle as well. And that, I think, is very much an important point. Picking on a few questions in the chat, you mentioned towards the end, indeed, the need to support new business models. And there's a question about, obviously, the role of stronger regulation, but also of financial incentives for market operators. Would you like to say a bit more of where you would recommend to really focus on, or a few ideas of financial incentives?
Yeah, thanks a lot for that question. We've been involved in a Horizon project looking at how the different member states and regions try to finance the transition towards a circular economy. And what we see that most of it still refers to waste management. There are plenty of programs for municipalities who want to invest in better recycling technologies. There are really little and really a scarce number of programs that would actually support new business models, for example, on sharing and leasing. So there is a need for focused support, especially for this kind of startups. And at the same time, we also see that there is the need to align regulations. We talked to a lot of startup companies who told us VAT rates. It's not the rate, it's the question, when do we have to pay it? And if you lease something, or if you try to lend it, for them, it really makes a difference if that's clearly regulated in the tax laws, or if it's up to sometimes even local administrations to define that. Now, for them, it's really difficult to convince banks to lend them money, as long as there are so many gray areas in that for that topic. And so I think this is something, also looking at the EU taxonomy, that is still not sufficiently addressed from my point of view.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, so both, I guess, private and public funding definitely have a lot to play, and quite a few instruments as well. There was a very specific clarification question on the chart, how to support waste prevention. There's a mention of informative measures. Could you clarify what you mean by informative here?
Yeah, we try to classify them in 4 groups, and one of them in informative measures, for example, awareness raising campaigns, consultancies, supporting companies by providing best practice examples. That is something that we've seen has dominated the policies on waste prevention, with the underlying assumption then that as long as you have sufficient information, the incentives would be enough to actually change behavior or to invest in new technologies. And now I think we're getting more and more aware that this will not be sufficient in many areas, and it might be in some, but for others we need clearer economic incentives or regulatory bans, for example.
Thanks, indeed, and often measures are indeed complementary. Maybe one last question. When you described the fact that we could save about half of the materials through recycling and half through really waste prevention measures, you also mentioned that in terms of economics, it was actually 90%. Could you maybe explain a bit more why this difference?
Yeah, if we look at the share of costs for companies linked to raw materials, we see that if they use more recycled materials, there are, I think, is an increasing awareness, especially right now with the scarcity for many raw materials, that there are cost-saving potentials. But compared to the amount of waste that they could save, or vice versa, generate from new business models focusing on that, by saving materials, by dematerialization, by waste prevention, by sharing, leasing, there is much more money to make. It often requires more specific investments. It's linked to to higher uncertainties because you don't really know, will this be accepted by consumers? For recycling, it's always very clear. You know the technology, you know exactly the outcomes. For prevention, it is more a question of companies willing to take that risk.
Thank you. So yeah, the gain is bigger, but the risk is also bigger. Is there like maybe final small question or follow-up question? Is there like a couple of barriers that you would identify as the biggest one for companies to actually take that risk?
Well, as a researcher, I would of course say there is a clear lack of knowledge, and more research would be needed, especially on the economics of waste prevention. We have very little knowledge. For example, looking at the policymakers, if you have a limited budget to spend on waste prevention, what are the most efficient waste prevention measures? On which sectors, on which type of measures should you spend it? And I think if the policymakers would feel more comfortable and have the feeling that they have a better knowledge base to build their policies on, I think the share of actually effective waste prevention policies could increase. Right now, we often hear we're not really sure what we can get in the end, what will be the outcomes. Yeah, and we need, for example, more economic research on that. If you look at the current work economists do, they focus a little on recycling. No one's really interested in this topic of waste prevention, and that's a bit sad.
Thank you, Henning. And that certainly plays a role. But we're also very happy to see institute like yours actually looking into it. Happy to pick up that conversation after the last presentation, which is also gonna focus on prevention and looking more specifically at the role of cutting consumption. So Maeve is with us from Brussels today. She's a resource justice and new economies campaigner with Friends of the Earth Europe, which is the largest grassroots environmental organization in Europe. Her background is in engineering, having qualified from the University College of Dublin. She worked as a civil and environmental engineer in Australia and the UK before taking up work on environmental policies with Friends of the Earth in 2015. She has worked on EU circular economy policies since, with a focus on land use and plastics in the past. Currently, she's focusing on overall consumption and resource use indicators, including looking at the material footprint and raw material mining related issues. She's also carrying a lot of work with national member groups on new economies. Maeve, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. Thank you for organizing, and I've really enjoyed the presentations so far. I'm going to share my screen. Yeah, so thanks again. As Justine said, I've been working with Friends of the Earth Europe in Brussels for 6 years now on resource use and circular economy issues, including closely with Zero Waste Europe on plastics for a few years, and in the last year more so on overall resource consumption and raw materials mining, and also with our network on the new economy work. So today I'm going to talk about, I think it's nice how the presentations so far, we're all kind of going towards the same goal that we need to reduce absolutely the resource consumption. That's the only way of solving all these many problems that we face today. So I think it's nice, and I think our presentations complement each other, looking at it a bit from different angles. So yeah, I'm going to talk a bit about how our absolute resource consumption is going beyond sustainable and just limits, and this overconsumption is harming people and planet, leading to greater waste, and it's not decreasing despite some of these circular economy, or many circular economy actions in Europe anyway, and rhetoric in recent years. And I'll go a bit into really looking at it more from a very root cause level. So looking at our growth-based economies and how to move away, we really need a massive transformation away from this economic model. I'll focus mostly on material consumption as it's closely tied to circular economy and has a well-developed indicator in the material footprint indicator. But it's just as important to look at other resource footprints like land, water, and carbon. And there needs to be especially more work to develop the land and water footprints, as well as the many other indicators that Casper and Henning mentioned. So firstly, just a quick look at on the global level. I think Casper already introduced really nicely the material flows, and maybe mine is a bit of a simpler picture than the really complex but very good and detailed graph that he showed. But we know that consumption has rapidly increased in the past half century at a global level, much faster than population growth. So since 1970, population has doubled, but extraction of materials has tripled. And we also know that there's a highly unequal consumption between populations. So 1.2 billion poorest people account for just 1% of global consumption, whereas the richest 1 billion account for 72%. So there's more money, resources, power, and impacts on planet and other people concentrated in the hands of very few people. And yeah, sorry, the graph there just shows the materials extracted since the start of the century to just 2009, so it goes a bit up further. Yeah, before I go into the EU consumption, I just wanted to touch on how do we measure material consumption. So what is the material footprint indicator? It's one way of measuring, and I think it's the most comprehensive and practical out there at the moment. It's used in the SDGs, and yeah, it's a well-developed indicator. It can also be called raw material consumption. So basically it measures the total mass of raw materials, which includes biomass, fossil fuels, metals, and non-metallic minerals that are extracted along entire supply chains in order to produce final products or services consumed in a country or region. So for example, looking at the material footprint of a smartphone would account for the equivalent weight of the full metal ores extracted of all the different metals that go into a smartphone, wherever in the world this happens. So it really ensures that extraction and the environmental and social pressures that come with it, outside of that of where something is finally consumed or used, is taken into consideration. It's also a good proxy for overall environmental damage caused. And we're promoting the use of course, the Eurostat measure material footprint for the EU. It's a slightly different but more robust methodology than there's also ones by the UN International Resources Panel, but they're aiming to merge the different methodologies over the coming years. But yeah, for the EU, the Eurostat is the most robust. So what is the EU material footprint and what's a sustainable and just level? The EU material footprint amounted to 14.5 tonnes per capita in the last time it was measured was 2018. It's, as you can see, well, this graph is only from 2000, but it's been rising for decades, and then it kind of dropped after the 2008 economic crisis, and ever since then has remained relatively stable, rising slightly in the past few years. So this might look like maybe a good picture, but it's also relatively stable in spite of the increasing political and industry rhetoric we're seeing and action on greening the economy and circular economy policies. And more importantly, it's stabilizing, but it's still, as you can see, we've got a line there over, I crudely did in paint, on global material or average material footprint per capita. So the EU are consuming well above the average global, and also based on best current research, which is gives slightly different levels of what's a sustainable and just level of material footprint per capita. It's kind of between 5 and 10. So some of the good research is done by Henning's colleagues in the Wuppertal Institute. They give a figure of 5 tons per capita, and then in the UN's Human Development Index, they say 10, and then other reports say somewhere in between there. So you can see we're consuming well above sustainable and just limits. Yeah, looking a bit then on the impacts of our material consumption. So we know that consumption is directly correlated with local and global environmental harms, human health impacts, conflicts. I paste in there some of you might know it's called the EJ Atlas, so Environmental Justice Atlas, and it maps out social conflicts around the world from environmental, linked with environmental issues like mining and so on. And yeah, also to mention the EU is highly reliant on imports, so most of these imports are coming from poor countries and regions. So our overconsumption is driving environmental and social impacts outside of the EU. And then to touch on, Henning and Casper already covered this, that looking at obviously more material consumption means more waste, even if it's recyclable. And of course, recycling rates need to be increased. But as mentioned, there's a limit to the role recycling and circularity can play. And recycling still has impacts on energy and resource demand. I know in some cases, some metals mining is actually requires more energy than or secondary recycling of zinc requires more energy than virgin extraction of zinc. So yeah, it's not a silver bullet, and there'll always be a relatively low potential for recycling and circularity, and also because of losses from energy carriers, and a lot is held in construction materials, which are recycled over longer periods. So coming back to the key is on reducing overall consumption. Yeah, I wanted to touch on, like I said at the start, what's really at the root, looking at the root of the problem, our growth-based economic model, and even the European Environment Agency have come out recently and a little bit in the past few years in some reports on, speaking out on how this is just a quote from one of their key messages from a briefing they did recently: growth is culturally, politically, and institutionally ingrained. So yeah, we know that this philosophy of continuous growth and expansion has become almost entrenched in Western society and now globally. Despite that, study after study shows that material wealth beyond a certain level doesn't lead to increase in happiness, well-being, or health. And I mentioned earlier that a sustainable and just level of material consumption would require the EU between 5 and 10, so it would require the EU cutting approximately in half its current consumption. And this may sound kind of daunting, but it's also not up to, I think we really need to stress, it's not up to individuals and behavioural change. The responsibility really lies with governments to drive this transition away from the growth-based economy and put policies in place that meet the needs of everyone, of all people on the planet, and not kind of pleasing big businesses is what we see a lot of these days, as people know. So yeah, and replacing material consumption and growth with less material intensive experiences and connections with people. And it's up to, again, I said not up to individuals and behavioral change, but it is up to people to be putting the pressure on our leaders and lead movements and that go towards change themselves. Sorry, I noticed I put the donut economy, which a lot of you probably know at this point. It's getting really big, and even some cities and countries are starting to look at policies based on this. So it looks at how can we satisfy the basic needs of all. So that's the social foundation, while being within planetary boundaries, and that's what they call the safe and just operating space for humanity. So it's a really nice, simple showing of where we need to go. So in terms of our main, this is really simplified to one of the main policy asks that we have at the moment, which is a binding EU material footprint reduction target. We've been pushing for this as Friends of the Earth a lot with the European Environmental Bureau for the past we've been working on this issue for many years, but especially we're trying to get it into the new Circular Economy Action Plan, which was published last March 2020. In the end, it got in in the monitoring framework. So we had good discussions with the Commission, but they didn't feel like it was ready for a target yet. But the Parliament, we worked with them, and they put in their recent opinion report on the action plan, asking for targets on material footprint. So that's a positive step. So we're trying to keep the momentum going a bit. Yeah, our arguments are kind of around how we have emissions reduction targets for climate, so we need the same for material reduction in circular economy policies, and that they must be designed with this as the goal instead of kind of what we're seeing as a new circular economy action plan comes out, and there's lots of great measures, but it's not known if what we've seen so far is it's not actually decreasing material consumption. Yeah, and of course, it's a complex task. There would need to be sub-material targets, maybe further targets within those, sectoral targets, plans to meet these, and then also tackling the distribution aspect, who's consuming the most. So it is a complex amount of work, but definitely necessary and possible. The German Environment Agency actually did a study looking at different scenarios, and one of their green supreme scenarios show that we can reduce material footprint to 4.1 tons per capita, which is even lower than the Wuppertal Institute by 2050, and they outlined how that can be done. So yeah, there's lots of research out there, and what we're kind of doing is pushing that the European Commission need to actually make a plan and do this. And I know another thing is bringing it into existing policies and stuff that's happening in the area of plastics and textiles and construction. And I know that many of the NGOs working in these specific areas are pushing for exactly that. And I just finally want to touch a bit on kind of linking to what's happening on, like what actually needs to happen on the ground, because it's a bit theoretical talking about a target, but what kind of plans would need to be put in place to move away from growth-based economy and thinking. So yeah, looking at shrinking sectors of the economy that are ecologically destructive and offer little, if any, social benefit, like military sector, space industry, they all consume so much resources, but what benefit are they providing to all people? And can grow then in other more socially useful and less environmentally impact areas. So I give a few examples here. For example, in the area of transport, greater safe bike infrastructure, accessible public transport, and a massive reduction in private cars and air travel. We're seeing a huge push now for electric cars, and this kind of comes with this massive push for decarbonisation, but maybe not really thinking about the shifting to the problems of mining for metals required for batteries and electric cars. So what we really need is a reduction in all private car use and air travel, same. And then looking at bigger infrastructures, so there's massive movements on the ground resisting new developments, stuff like shopping centres that are driving this consumer culture, new roads, opening of new mines. There's a big push at the moment of metals for the green transition and digitalization and increasing mining in Europe for that. So there's massive movements all around Europe trying to prevent that, and then trying to bring in the systemic picture that, okay, it doesn't mean that there's still support that we get these metals from outside of Europe, and that's okay. And finally, on the product level, so yeah, increasing reusable package with deposit schemes, ensuring the right to repair, stopping planned obsolescence in law, and really strictly regulating the advertising industry. So this is just really quick examples, and I think Henning gave some really good ones as well. But I will leave it there. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Maeve. Yeah, very complimentary presentation, I think. And, the last point you made, I think, are very important in terms of really looking at it from a holistic perspective, and also looking at the infrastructure system and the culture around it, and the need to address that to prevent maybe just a substitution of one problem with another. So I think that's very important. There was a question from one of the listeners about, okay, so if a material is actually very important or crucial in the manufacturing of a product, what can be then the kind of measures or ways to still reduce the material footprint linked to the extraction of this material?
Yeah, I guess we always try to look at the bigger picture. So there's a lot happening. For example, at the EU level, there's product environmental footprint, and often it ends up getting boiled down to, okay, you look at a single product and how can we make that more efficient, or how can we, but it's also really looking at how many you can make one single product as efficient as possible. Like you can have a plastic water bottle, and we're seeing they're making, how can you use the least amount of plastic possible to still keep a structure in the plastic bottle, but if you still consume thousands of if you're not looking at plastic bottles and why we're consuming so much in the first place, it really doesn't make a difference if you're making that single product more efficient. So I think that's what we'd really focus on, is a systemic trend, and what is that product being used for. And even if it's really necessary, I mean, plastic bottles, you can argue they're not so necessary in general, but a product like a smartphone, how can you make that, design it to be longer lasting, that it can be repairable at the end of life, that companies don't just keep marketing their products so that more people consume them. So looking at different things like that, as well as making the product more efficient, but really looking at the overall picture as well, I would say.
Thank you very much. Maybe one question is, I mean, I think it links to that as well. You brought a little bit the question of decarbonization, and do you see example where sometimes maybe the agenda towards decarbonization can actually not be so much compatible with other or the bigger picture around reducing the material footprint, for example, like how, as you said, it's a complex issue, and decarbonization is also very, very high on the agenda for a very good reason. So how do you kind of find compromises? Is it about compromises, or how do you find a solution that benefits both aspects?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit about compromises, but I touched on the electric cars a little bit already, but that's a big area we're seeing it, this drive for basically swapping, in order to meet kind of carbon emissions reduction, switching fossil fuel-based cars for electric cars, which rely on an input of, well, actually, a lot of them even rely on an input of electricity that comes from fossil fuels at the moment. But even if that turns to an input of renewable electricity, it's still, I mean, the batteries require, really material intensive. A lot of different metals go into them that come with their own impacts. Even renewable energies like wind and solar, the massive push for that. So it's really about, it's decarbonization, but still consuming business as usual, like trying to keep our same economy, same lifestyle, same consumption, but switching to renewables and switching to electric cars that are way more material intensive, and kind of shifting the problems from the fossil fuel extraction and processing to more metals and non-metallic minerals, mining and processing, which is really, really impactful and increasing a lot and causing a lot of, we worked with a lot of communities around Europe at the moment who are facing, for example, lithium mine, new lithium mines being opened in Europe and so on. So it's really looking at the bigger consumption picture rather than shifting from fossils to renewables.
Thank you very much, Maeve. And thank you to Caspar and Henning as well. So I'm suggesting we're opening the floor to everybody now, and if Caspar and Henning can come back with us with the video, that's even better, because it's always nicer to see you. Thank you very much. And I'll keeping the questions, so please keep the questions coming, and I'll keep an eye. Maybe one to start with, and let's see who wants to jump on this one. But one aspect that I think sometimes is not so much taken into consideration when I talk about the circular economy is that, of course, there's a circular economies. Often there's the decarbonization agenda that go hand in hand, and for me, there's a third that is very critical. It's the detoxification agenda and all that is done around, notably in the EU, the chemicals strategy for sustainability. And often the question of non-toxicity and ensuring non-toxicity to achieve also a circular economy and actually make that loop like clean is not necessarily super well covered. Do you can you talk a bit more maybe about this, like in your different methodologies, maybe Caspar and Henning, is it something you take into account? Are there limits to take that into account? What's your perspective on that? And I'm not sure who wants to start, but feel free to jump in.
Shall I quickly start us off and then Henning, you continue? I can briefly touch upon it from our perspective. So yeah, toxicology of or toxicity of materials is certainly a huge part of the circular economy to remove that as much as possible. And I think one of the points that I try to make is that in our current metrics frameworks that we have, it's extremely difficult to make that tie, to bring it in sufficiently, at least on a macroeconomic level. On a microeconomic level, we can then look into individual products and then do more elaborate studies, and then that works. And there's impact assessment frameworks to do that. But then how do we scale that up to the macroeconomic level to start setting broader targets on this? And then also, I think what's important to consider is how do we align also all the objectives of the circular economy here? So for instance, if we think about equipment that stays in the economy for a really long time, for instance, buildings or large machinery that, has been built over a long time using certain substances. And if all of a sudden we say all of these substances are to go out of the system immediately, does that mean that all the buildings need to be demolished, all the equipment needs to be decommissioned? That's then very much conflicting with the other ambition of the circular economy to keep things in use for as long as possible. So I think the toxicity aspect is a really important one, and we need to include that much more in the metric measurement framework. But I think also there we need to kind of differentiate and always sort of weigh the balance of how we can really make sure that we best achieve all the objectives of a circular economy, and then see how also our targets on achieving certain levels match different industry contexts.
Yeah, I can only confirm the challenge that Caspar just described. Looking at resource and material flows, we often focus on these quantitative aspects and not really taking into account the specific impacts. And I think here is some homework for all of us to do, because if you look at the climate change discussion, that only received political attention as soon as we had some knowledge base and robust models showing the specific impacts of not doing something for mitigating climate change. And this knowledge is still very scattered, scarce, and shaky for the resources. Now, what is the specific benefits of using 1 ton of materials less? That is very different in different areas of the world. 1 liter of water has a completely different value in Finland compared to somewhere in the South Sahara. So there is still a lot to be done on modeling that and then deriving also targets and policies from that. But of course, it's not the solution to completely stay away from it. And that's what we see, for example, with waste prevention. Waste prevention, according to the Waste Framework Directive, covers quantitative prevention as well as qualitative prevention. So using less hazardous materials. And if we look at the waste prevention programs and how they're implemented, that completely doesn't show up. It's left to other agencies, other actors who maybe not call it waste prevention, but here we lack any stringent ideas how to integrate that. We lack targets, we lack measurements. And I think especially this issue of phasing out toxic materials can't be left to market mechanisms at all. So no, we all should go back and think about how can we include that more systematically in our work.
Thank you, Henning. And maybe linked to that or broadening it again, but there's a few questions about where do you see the priorities areas in Europe specifically in the coming years, also in terms of policies. In the context of the Green Deal, like where do you think the key intervention points are to achieve those objectives, notably in relation to, you know, focusing on waste prevention? There's including a very specific more question on the target for waste prevention. Like, would you see more of a reduction in percentages or in kilogram, or should it be a cap? And if you think it should be a reduction or a maximum per capita, do you have a number in mind? Can we be that precise already? So yeah, maybe we can start with Henning on this one, and then whoever wants to complement.
Well, no, I don't have a specific figure in mind. We had a long battle in the context of revising the German waste prevention program. Should it at all have any indicator, or could it have a quantified target? And right now we have, for the very first time, something like a quantified target, indicating that the process of decoupling waste generation from economic growth should be continued in the coming years, so over the next 6 years. This is, of course, an extremely weak target, because it allows the waste generation to grow as long as the economy grows faster. But at least we have an entry point, something that people on the municipal level now working on this can refer to and say, okay, we contribute to a clear quantified target. So for me, setting any target is probably more important than another 2 or 3 years discussion about what specific target should we have.
Yeah, I can add to that. Yeah, for us, actually, just what Henning said there at the end, when it comes to the material, I think for any indicator, it's never going to be perfect. There's never going to be the perfect data that exists and methodology. There's always going to be some, but yeah, for us in terms of material footprint, it's better than nothing. And I think for us, it's really like a driver. We can see that we consume too much, and it's the driver saying, okay, it's like the emissions target, that's really driving this whole decarbonization agenda, which is, like I mentioned earlier, having an impact on switching to more materials. So we need at the same time material reduction targets. And yeah, we also acknowledge that it's a lot of work to set a target. And there'll probably be a new circular economy action plan, I imagine, 2024 when the new commission comes in. So we're really trying to get this current commission to have maybe a target ready to put in place by then in the new circular economy action plan. And in the meantime, really, like I mentioned earlier, that many civil society is pushing for a reduction in the different sectors, like in energy and plastics and textiles. And I also want to quickly touch on Henning's mention of decoupling. This is something we see, and even the European Environment Agency have now said that it's kind of a distracting to aim for decoupling, which, yeah, if you're trying to aim for keeping increasing economic growth while at the same time trying to reduce resource consumption, it's shown more and more to be a bit of an impossible aim. There's some relative decoupling exists where economic growth continues and there is a small, slower growth in resource consumption. But yeah, completely decoupling them is likely impossible. So I think we really need to keep the focus on reducing resource consumption, whether the economy grows or not.
Thank you both. Henning, you mentioned cities, and there's a few actors we talked a bit about today, I think. So regulation, the role of also EU decision makers, and you mentioned a few regulation, and we know there's quite a few regulation revision upcoming or directive revision upcoming in the coming years. There was a question about individual level. Can we, apply circular economy to our individual level? I think Maeve made it very clear that the responsibility shouldn't be on consumers, but really more on governments. Henning, you mentioned the role of cities. Indeed, they can play a big role. They kind of often a lab as well to try ideas. They also are the one dealing with waste management when it comes to that. And then there's also businesses, and I know Caspar, you do quite a lot of work with businesses as well. So I was just maybe getting your sense of where do you think the role of maybe cities and more broadly communities can be into this transition, and if Caspar, you want to add something about the businesses as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot for highlighting the potential role of cities, because what we've seen in a couple of projects where we were lucky enough to support, for example, the city of Kiel to become the sadly very first German zero waste city. I know it's challenging to believe looking at how many cities already have that status in France or Italy, but in Germany it was the first one. And for us that was a really inspiring process, because we wanted to include all the citizens in the development of such a strategy. And when we began, we booked a room for 20 people because we saw who's actually interested in that. And then we had more than 200 people willing to spare and spend their time discussing with that. And we got so interesting projects, initiatives, ideas from the discussions between the different citizens. And that was now officially brought forward by the local parliament. And for me, it's, as you said, it's the role of a laboratory where you can test something and develop something, but it's also the link between individuals actually wanting to change something and the policy level, because especially at the city level, you have the chance to develop your own ideas into official policies and official strategies. And for that reason, I think it makes a lot of sense to do that. For me, it would be, or the next step will be to bring these cities more and more together, because my feeling is that too many of the cities still have to reinvent the wheel every time. I think this new secretariat on circular cities and regions could be a breakthrough, and it's supposed to start in the beginning of next year. So a network of really ambitious cities could be, from my point of view, a huge driver for circular economy as well as for waste prevention.
Maybe chiming into that also a bit more from highlighting the business perspective. I like the point, Henning, that you made just towards the end, that it needs to be more of a concerted effort and a collaborative one. And I think also in the business space, maybe where you'd expect that even less so, I think it's really important to recognize that in reaching these goals of increased circularity also on a national or regional level, we need to very much look at the value chain level and what are the value chains that ultimately bring products to us. And in the value chain, there's usually a lot of different businesses involved, and they need to be working together to make this happen. That also entails kind of working with the same type of fact base, same evidence base, same metrics ultimately to agree on, so they can together set a baseline of what is their circularity currently and where do they want to go and how can they achieve that together. And of course, there's also a big point to say about how businesses can do so by reinventing also that concept of economic growth and maybe helping us even innovating beyond this. Can we even grow further? How can we decouple through new business models and new revenue models? And I think it's even too early to say, can we decouple or not? Because there's so much innovation that we haven't tried out yet, and so many new business models that are only just setting up of new service-based business models, leasing models, and so on, that provide access rather than the ownership of goods. And I think that one of the things that we need to focus on is to enable these businesses to do so more. So make sure that the risks that they're currently facing are also accounted for. Well, they're facing a lot of risks that are currently preventing them from attracting financing. For instance, they don't have the track record yet to attract financing. So supporting them through these kind of challenges, whilst also creating a level playing field by, for instance, accounting for externalities that are caused by more linear business models. I think that's really crucial. And then we'll start seeing even what the potential of that truly is. And I think that'll be quite inspiring and quite exciting, actually.
Thank you, Caspar. Maeve, do you want to add anything on the community level, or?
No, but I agree what they said, and I like the positive outlook, Caspar. Yeah, I think also you mentioned the zero waste cities and zero waste communities. It would be great if they joined up together. There's a lot, as I said, happening on the donut economics, and cities starting to implement these kind of policies and working on that. So it'll be also, yeah, nice to see these kind of merge. I think there's a lot of potential to work at the city level, since so many people live in cities, and that's what it's really about, changing people's minds and behaviors and working with governments and businesses on this.
Thank you. Yeah, and obviously Zero Waste Europe is also working a lot on cities, because it's indeed this kind of very interesting ecosystem where everybody seems closer. I like what you said, Elling, about bringing kind of this willingness of individual to change, and also the policy link is so much closer. And I think there's also obviously a link with businesses and local businesses and etc. that brings this kind of whole ecosystem very much together. And indeed, donut economics and Amsterdam trying it is one example, as we have someone from Amsterdam today. So we very much, I think, emphasize the role of waste prevention and really focusing on reduction and prevention. Yet there's still a question on recyclability and recycling from one of our listeners. And specifically, probably for you, Caspar and Henning, whether you are focusing on the verification of recyclability for packaging in particular, and also if you're looking into like standardization of recycling information on packaging to really basically support the circular economy.
Well, maybe this time I can start. I think both topics are, of course, crucially important if we want to become more circular. Looking at recyclability, I think it will be really important to standardize these definitions, and while doing it, not to put too much emphasis on what is potentially recyclable, but what will be actually recycled, and that will differ from region to region in Europe. It will depend on the collection systems. It will depend also on specific behavior by consumers. And this idea of a product can be recyclable everywhere under the same conditions, I think this is can lead to extremely false implications and then policies. And it has to be clear that any standard on recyclability has to take that into account. And then the second point, for me, the information on contained raw materials, on the origins, on the share of recycled materials, I think that we will have an intense discussion on these material passports that is now launched or initiated for batteries. From what I've heard, the next thing will be some pilots on passports for packaging. And there again, of course, no, it sounds very simple to keep the information, to provide them to recyclers so that it's easier to close the loop. But for example, if you look at plastics, the quality of plastic at the very beginning, when a product is put on the market, is probably something different from the quality of the material after 5 years of use phase. No? And how to take that into account, how to provide also information on how the specific product was used to recycle. I think there's still much work to be done. Although I strongly believe in the tool and the instrument. No, we need these passports. We need a more digital circular economy when it aims to become competitive to the current linear system.
Yeah, actually not much to add from my end on this. I think the point that you mentioned about recording not just on actual recycling, but also recyclability, and having those both separately to also really acknowledge that there needs to be a whole system and infrastructure in place. That's quite important. And then these types of initiatives, such as a material passport, I think can really contribute to that.
Thanks a lot, Caspar. Any last word, Maeve?
Well, I know there's a lot of organizations, civil society on the call, so it's kind of, on the material footprint lobbying aspect, it's a lot Friends of the Earth and the European Environmental Bureau. So if anybody wants to, we're kind of a bit in the middle of what to do next at the moment, because it's very theoretical, and it would be great to have more brainstorming with other organizations and their thoughts on how we can develop this work further and get more kind of civil society support from different levels. So I'll put my email address in the chat box if anyone wants to get in touch and share their ideas or talk it through or anything. That would be great.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to the three of you for really inspiring discussion and tools that you presented. Thank you for the great question from everyone here today. I think we partly answered the question, are we getting closer to a circular economy? I think the answer is we're not quite yet there, because I think you all showed that despite the fact that circular economy has been so high on the agenda in Europe for maybe close to a decade now, with several circular economy action plan, actually the resource use is continuing to increase. And we're not really getting closer to circularity. I think we really showed how we really need to focus on reduction and risk prevention, still recognizing the role that, of course, recycling has to play in also closing the loop. The role of legislation, the role of financial incentives, and probably the need to really look more thoroughly into those and what are those that are actually going to make the concept a reality, because indeed, as we just mentioned with recyclability and real recycling, it's where really that's going to make a difference when it actually becomes a reality. And there's quite a lot of actors that are definitely motivated to do that and to make that happening. So definitely the transition is happening, and that's a positive sign, and more is very much needed. So thank you very much. We'll continue that conversation for sure. Just to all of the participants, you will be able to find a recording of the webinar in the link that my dear colleague just shared on the chat. The presentation of Maeve, Caspar, and Henning will also be available. And we'll have our last webinar before the summer break next month on the 15th of June. And the topic of this one will be, are we entering an age of decommissioning? If you're interested, you can find more information on the Zero Waste Cities website. I thank you very much for this great 90 minutes. Thank you, Maeve, Caspar, and Henning again, and looking forward to continue the discussion. Take care, everyone.